Live NFL trivia every Tuesday night on Twitch at 10 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge and have a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation.
And Mark Semino got jacked up. Brett Favre winces and says, oh, you got rough look in the eyes. I got jacked up. They tell you get out of bounds. Get down. Get out of bounds. Get down. Get down. Oh!
There are hundreds of sports shows out there. You know what the mark of a really good one is? If you're watching the show and you're waiting for a recurring segment to air, that's always a really good sign. With all of these shows being very similar and unable to differentiate themselves from one another, if you can find something that makes your show stand out, then you've got gold on your hands. Many people watch Inside the NBA on TNT so they can see Shaq and a Fool. Many people watch College Game Day so they can see Lee Corso make his pick and put on the headgear. Many people watch SportsCenter so that they can see the top 10 plays. Many people watch Fox NFL Sunday so that they can see Rob Riggle wait, scratch that. Does anyone actually watch specifically for that part? Anyone? Bueller? But if you're like me, and you grew up in the mid-2000s on football, you are likely watching Monday Night Countdown specifically for one segment and one segment only.
Making the hit of the day, Michael Pittman, get out of the way because you got jacked up.
That's right, the biggest, baddest hits of the week in a glorious 2-minute segment known as Jacked Up. Before we had YouTube compilation videos of big hits, before we had Game Pass and the ability to go back and rewatch games and highlights, and before we had social media making hits like these inescapable, we had Jacked Up. If you wanted to watch SportsCenter to find these highlights, it was a total crapshoot. Back then, they had no information bar on the left side of the screen to show you what was coming up next. You didn't know if they were going to show the highlights of your game, and if they did, it might only be a play or two depending on how big of a blowout it was, or how insignificant of a game it was. Very rarely would they ever show a defensive highlight that didn't result in a turnover. But with Jacked Up, you knew exactly what you were getting. You knew you were going to see all the hits, and you knew you were going to see all of the top defenders laying shot after shot on unsuspecting offensive players. It's been over a decade since the last episode of Jacked Up aired, and people are still nostalgic for it. But despite being the most popular segment on the show, and maybe the most popular segment in any NFL pregame show ever, it disappeared after 4 years, never to be seen again. No giant fanfare, no chance to say goodbye. Why was that the case? Why did ESPN, seemingly out of nowhere, just decide to get rid of what almost everyone considered to be the best part of their pregame show? This is the complete history, from the rise to the fall, of one of the greatest and most controversial pregame segments of all time. This is the complete history of Jacked Up. Our story starts back in 1993, when ESPN launched a pregame show for Monday Night Football known as NFL Prime Monday. The show was not particularly strong right off the bat. In fairness, ESPN was always going to be behind the 8 ball with a pregame show back in 1993. You couldn't do a really good preview of the game at hand, since you couldn't do the show from the stadium site since ABC had the rights to the game. You couldn't do a really good highlight show of what happened on Sunday, because then it would just be a repeat of NFL Primetime, which you aired the night before, and which everyone was already tuned into since you had the rights to Sunday Night Football for most of the year. One option you couldn't do was because of broadcast limitations, and the other option you couldn't do was because you did way too good of a job at it the night before. NFL Primetime is awesome, and yeah, it still holds up to this day. ESPN tried, but it didn't seem to work. As John Romano of the Tampa Bay Times said when the show came out, ESPN's new NFL Prime Monday may have the best 60 minutes of football coverage of the week. Unfortunately, it lasts for 90 minutes. They had some really odd personalities on the show, including Skip Bayless, and at the start of the show, Downtown Julie Brown. And I'm not talking about a situation like Jimmy Kimmel or Rob Riggle with the NFL on Fox where they did a comedic skit and that was it. No, she was conducting interviews and actually had a pivotal role on the show. The show had to rebrand to Monday Night Countdown after a few years and was still struggling to find its footing and its identity. And so with the show not doing too well, and with ratings for Monday Night Football on ABC still being relatively low, even after they got John Madden to do color commentary, ESPN knew they needed to do something. Senior coordinating producer Mike Leber was on a flight from Houston to Hartford during the 2003 offseason, and had a rather brilliant idea to spice up the show. What can you say about the week in football and the upcoming game that hadn't been said by Monday night, especially with the internet and online forum boards starting to rise in popularity, and with shows like Around the Horn and PTI already on your network? Turns out, not a whole lot. But you can use the personalities that you have and make something unique and make something happen in that way. Monday Night Countdown had some former players on their team. They had Ron Jaworski, a 15-year veteran in the NFL at quarterback who made the Pro Bowl and made it to the Super Bowl in 1980 with the Philadelphia Eagles. They had Michael Irvin, a 5-time Pro Bowl wide receiver with the Dallas Cowboys, who would eventually wind up in the Hall of Fame. And they had Tom Jackson, a 14-year veteran with the Broncos who played linebacker, made 3 Pro Bowls, and made it to 2 Super Bowls. Leber decided it was time to use these personalities and play to their strengths. What are quarterbacks known for? Well, they're known for chalking up plays and leading their team down the field. And so Leber came up with the Sunday Drive segment, where Jaws would break down a key scoring drive from start to finish and do an X's and O's of the segment. Okay, Jaws is done. What are wide receivers known for? Well, they're known for making big plays. And so Leber came up with the Playmakers segment, where Irvin would look at the top playmakers and plays from Sunday's slate of games. 2 down, 1 to go. What are linebackers known for? Well, they're known for hitting people. They're known for delivering the kill shots, leveling guys over the middle, and installing fear in anyone who comes near them. And so, Leber came up with what would be, without a doubt, the most popular segment on the show. He came up with the segment that maybe changed the game of football forever. That segment, of course, was Jacked Up. Jacked Up was a segment unlike anything else on television. The name comes from looking at raw tape from NFL films where you could hear guys saying after a big hit that they got jacked up. How this segment worked was like this. For the first 3 seasons, from 2003 to 2005, during the pregame show, the 5 biggest hits of the week were shown. The hit was shown in real time, and then through some alternate angles straight out of a game of NFL Street. At the end, Tom Jackson would either praise the defensive player, laugh at the offensive player, or do a combination of both, with everyone on the crew joining in at the end, saying that he got jacked up. There were a few stipulations to this, as the segment had some morals. If the hit resulted in a penalty, it wasn't shown. You couldn't intentionally rough the passer or deliver a cheap shot and be featured on the segment. It had to be a clean, legal hit. If the hit resulted in a guy getting hurt, it wasn't shown. The jacked up hits were only for players who, in the words of Chumbawamba, got knocked down but got back up again. If they were kept down, it wasn't shown. Now we'll get to the problems with this in a bit, because while this looked like a solid strategy on paper to not show guys getting injured, it didn't always work out that way. In 2006, ESPN changed the formula of the segment now that they had the rights to the game instead of ABC. But they did it in a really clever way that made you want to watch the game and the halftime show. In other words, it was the exact opposite of what the Genesis halftime show did. If you have 30 minutes to kill and want to learn way too much about the history of the Genesis halftime show, check out the video in the upper right corner. They expanded the program from 5 hits to 6. Hits 6 through 4 were shown at the end of Monday Night Countdown, while hits 3 through 1 were shown during the halftime show. Other than that, ESPN did not change the formula for the 4 years that this segment aired. They knew their audience. They knew this was working. And they didn't want to reinvent the wheel. For the most part, Jacked Up was incredibly well received. Yes, there were some critics, and we're going to get way in depth on that in just a bit. But this was the segment that ESPN needed to revive their pregame show. Once Jacked Up entered the fold, it became must-see television for many football fans across the country. I cannot stress this enough. There was nothing else like this on television. Before this, The only extended hit segment was a 45-minute VHS tape from 1985 of NFL Crunch Course. Before YouTube highlights and compilation videos were everywhere, this was how you watched defensive highlights, since highlight shows typically focused on the plays that resulted in points. For a lot of people, this was their introduction to football, and I'm included in this. The peak of Jacked Up was around the time that I started to really get into football, and obviously while this segment wasn't the only reason I got into football, it definitely helped. I loved watching this segment. This was appointment television for me growing up, and I'm sure a lot of others felt the same way. And the segment caught on like wildfire. The phrase became synonymous with big hits. One Sports Illustrated article noted that at a high school hockey game, every time a player got checked, the student body chanted that he got jacked up. Tom Jackson, who used to be known for his work in the NFL and with NFL Primetime, was quickly becoming known as the jacked up guy, hearing the phrase wherever he went. It was so popular and so well received that even PR reps for NFL teams would text him after games, nominating players and hits for the segment. Players around the league knew about it. If you were on defense, you wanted to do everything in your power to get on. If you were on offense, you wanted desperately to not be featured. Jacked Up was a major hit, and many people loved it. But the segment did not come without its controversy. It did not come without its critics and detractors. The only problem? The critics of this segment actually had some really good and valid concerns. As you can probably expect, there were definitely critics of this segment. But this wasn't just a case of some critics not liking something and it being a matter of personal preference. This was a case of critics saying that this segment was harmful on football and in some ways, the youth of America. And yeah, they've actually got a pretty good point. This segment did not come without controversy, and you can probably guess where this one is going. I think the best way to go over the complaints is to pick apart a quote made by Tom Jackson in a 2007 edition of Sports Illustrated. While Jackson said that if a guy got injured or penalized, the hit would not be shown on the segment, he said that if a guy is dazed, that's another story. In other words, depending on the severity of it, hits that resulted in concussions were 100% fair game for the segment. Telling with the naked eye whether a guy is injured or not is easy. If the guy is laying on the ground after a hit holding his leg, you can probably assume that he's got a leg injury. But if a guy has a concussion, you can't really spot that. If a lesser known player gets jacked up, then walks off the field a bit dizzy but never drops to the ground and a timeout is never taken, and then never returns to the game, TV production and sideline reporters might not pick that up. The guy clearly has a concussion, but because of those circumstances, it would probably get shown on the segment. When you say that no hits that showed injuries would be featured on the segment, and then you say one sentence later that concussions can be featured, you're completely contradicting yourself. Even though concussion awareness and recognition were not as prevalent back then as it is today, segments like this still raised eyebrows. There's also the criticism that this segment was destroying the game at the lower levels and potentially the health of kids across the country. Kids are easily impressionable. It's why there are rules about advertising to children on television and what you can and cannot show. It's why less than a decade prior to the golden era of Jacked Up, Joe Camel was discontinued. When you show these kinds of hits to kids, and you highlight these hits for the world to see, and you praise the defenders and criticize the offensive players for getting humiliated like this, you're sending the message that not only is this cool, but that this is the right way to play football. This is the way you play defense. The only problem with that is that these are professionals. These are players who, for the most part, know how to tackle. They've been in the game for a while. They've been coached up. I'd like to assume that they've been surrounded by coaches that know what they're doing, especially at the professional and the collegiate level, and maybe even lower down the ladder depending on where they went to high school. You show a bunch of 8 and 9-year-old children these hits and glorify it, and because they're easily impressionable and want to imitate what they think is cool, they want to go off and do this during their games. The only problem is that they have no technique. Their coach is likely a parent who doesn't know what he or she is doing, and is using this as a way to bond with his child or get his child involved in athletics. And when you have a bunch of children who don't know better and don't have any technique or form, who grew up on Jacked Up and grew up thinking that making the opponent dizzy was cool, you have a bunch of children who know nothing about playing defense other than hit them hard and knock them out, it becomes incredibly dangerous. Tom Jackson said that the segment doesn't promote violence, saying the players love to be on the segment, but I guarantee you none of them are out there on the field thinking about Jacked Up while they're playing. They have to make decisions too quickly. And I completely agree with him when it comes to NFL players. But for children and Pee-wee players, you bet they're thinking about it, especially since the speed of the game is significantly slower. Look, we were all kids once. When you were young and games got out of hand, in any sport you were playing, your goal probably shifted from let's win the game to let's make a highlight reel play. The goal was to make SportsCenter and make it onto ESPN. And these kids grew up thinking that big hits were the way to do it. You're not going to get outside praise for proper tackling, but if you lay the wood on someone and knock them down silly, and someone's got a camera with them, you're going to become an overnight celebrity. For kids who played football across the country, Jacked Up was like those incredibly dangerous stunts that Evel Knievel, the Wallendas, and David Blaine do. Except instead of a disclaimer saying to not try this at home, it felt more like an open invitation. The show had its critics throughout all 4 seasons. But then, something happened in 2007 that stopped the show in its tracks. Because after 4 years, the show would disappear. When the 2007 season rolled around, fans were expecting the most popular segment of the show to continue. But when week 1 came, and when fans tuned into halftime of the Bengals-Ravens game, Jacked Up was nowhere to be found. Instead, to fill the time, you got Mike Wilbon and Tony Kornheiser doing a live mini-episode of PTI. Remember that Kornheiser was in the booth as the color commentator for the first few seasons of Monday Night Football on ESPN. So you had that corporate synergy going on. Now don't get me wrong, I like PTI. It's one of just a handful of shows nowadays on ESPN that I can stomach, and I watched it fairly religiously growing up. But I think every fan was thinking the same question when they saw Wilbon and Kornheiser on their screens. Where's Jacked Up? Maybe they moved it completely to the pregame show. Maybe they were doing it as part of a postgame show to try and get viewers to stick around for the whole game. But as the weeks went on, the complaints rolled in, and the show was still nowhere to be found. Many people felt a sinking feeling. Was Jacked Up gone? Did ESPN just kill off their biggest and most popular segment? Turns out, they did. With no announcement, no press release, and no fanfare whatsoever, Jacked Up was quietly canceled. It was gone. Some reports say that ESPN themselves pulled the plug, though most say that the NFL told ESPN to cancel the program. But regardless of what organization did it, the reason behind it was exactly the same. Jacked Up was not a healthy segment for the game. As concussion awareness and recognition began to get taken more seriously, and more studies were being shown that linked hard hits to CTE and brain damage, a segment like this seemed tone deaf. It's promoting an aspect of football that could significantly harm players down the line, could severely reduce the number of people who want to play football, and could kill the sport down the road. Remember that something else happened between 2006 and 2007 that could have led to the NFL changing their mind about this segment. The 2007 season was Roger Goodell's first full season as the commissioner. He became the commissioner on September 1st, 2006, just a few days before the season started, and with no off-season whatsoever. Maybe it was too late for ESPN to make changes to their programming lineup. Maybe Goodell had bigger things on his plate at first than to worry about a television segment. Maybe Goodell didn't have the information necessary about CTE and brain damage since he wasn't the commissioner yet. But as he assumed the office, he talked to more medical personnel and oversaw more. But in 2007, Goodell started issuing his stamp on football through a few different measures. He wanted to grow the game more internationally, and did this by playing the first regular season overseas game ever, when the Giants and Dolphins met at Wembley Stadium. He wanted to clean up the conduct and reputation that the league had, and suspended players who were in violation of this code of conduct, including Pac-Man Jones for the entire season, Chris Henry for the first 8 games, and Tank Johnson for the first 8 games. And he wanted to make the game safer. And I don't think it's a coincidence that all of this coincides with the lawsuit in the wake of the death of Mike Webster due to CTE. The U.S. Court of Appeals ruled against the NFL on December 13, 2006, saying that the NFL owed Webster's estate over $1 million. Money talks, and while $1 million is just a drop in the bucket for an organization that is now pulling in 11 figures a year, at the end of the day, it's still $1 million. It's likely that Goodell saw the writing on the wall, saw what was coming in the future if incidents like this continued to occur, and was set to make his mark as commissioner by preventing as much of this as possible. And if one way to do it is by canceling a TV segment, then so be it. Think of the complete 180 that happened when the switch was made at commissioner from Paul Tagliabue to Roger Goodell. In the final years of Tagliabue's run as commissioner, we got an entire franchise of NFL Blitz games. We got the hit stick added to Madden. We got this segment and an absolute glorification of hard hits. Under Goodell, that was not going to happen. During that 2007 offseason, the NFL had a symposium about concussions and made rules requiring players to take baseline neuropsychological tests during training camp. Any player who suffered a head injury would then be tested against those baseline requirements. What seems like common sense nowadays was a brand new thing for the NFL in 2007, when Goodell was in his first full season in charge. It was a complete changing of the guard. We were about to enter a new era in pro football. And so, after 4 seasons, Jacked Up was nowhere to be found. Today, it lives as a distant memory in the eyes of those that watched it and grew up on it. But did it have to be this way? There's a question I always like to ask myself when doing a look back at failed projects, or in this case, retired projects. Could something like this work today? Could they bring back Jacked Up and have it work? And the sad part for me is that as much as I loved Jacked Up growing up, there is no way anything like this can work today. There are certain things that are just a product of the times, and it's best they stay that way. If you bring back Jacked Up and make it a sanitized version, it becomes completely unrecognizable, and dare I say it, it becomes boring to watch. It becomes a disgrace to the name, and it tarnishes the history of the original program. But at the same time, if you bring back Jacked Up and change absolutely nothing whatsoever, it won't work because it's completely insensitive. It goes against everything the NFL has tried to promote. It glorifies an element of the game that we don't necessarily want. The only thing I could see that could possibly work in today's day and age that's similar to this is a pancake block segment that showcases the best pancake blocks of the week. But something like the original Jacked Up with hard defensive hits? No way. And I think the main lesson from Jacked Up is a good lesson for life itself. There are some things that were great in the past, but should stay in the past. There are some things that were incredible products for their time, and are really fun to look back on. But bringing them back would just be a bad idea. Society has changed. Some things in society can work as things evolve and progress, but some things cannot. And it's not just Jacked Up. It's a lot of things on sports television. Highlight shows don't make a whole lot of practical sense now that the NFL simply uploads full 10-minute games of highlights the moment a game is over. Weekly recap shows like This Week in Pro Football and This is the NFL don't make any sense now. There was a time where networks used to show the halftime shows on the field, but now that these networks can get highlights instantaneously, to not show these highlights at halftime and during the game as they happen doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Things change. Things that were awesome back then make no sense nowadays. And it's not because the idea was bad or anything like that, it's just that the climate is completely different. It was just a product of its time. Even though the show is drawn out and can be quite stale at times, there are some recurring segments on Monday Night Countdown that are pretty good, and that I look forward to. Come On Man is definitely more hit or miss nowadays than it was even just a few years ago, since now they'll often take NFL plays that everyone's seen already, or take college and high school football plays to the point where non-NFL things are comprising the majority of the segment. But when that segment hits, man does it hit. And after a somewhat shaky start, they might have something in You Got Mossed, as that segment seems to have found its footing and a popular catchphrase. But as great as those segments can be, they didn't do what Jacked Up did. They couldn't replicate the excitement that the great but controversial segment did. It's been nearly a decade and a half since the last episode aired, and yet anytime I see a good, clean hit that's powerful or jars the ball free, I will find myself saying the iconic words of Tom Jackson. Because the best way to describe plays like that is with 4 simple words. He got jacked up. Special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.